Okay, good evening everybody, and you're all very welcome. It's my honour and privilege to do the introductions this evening for our talk on Dún Ailinne. First of all, a special welcome to you all, to everybody who's here, because obviously everybody has a great interest in Dún Ailinne, and it's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful that the work is still going on the site, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that as the night progresses. So I'll start with Professor Susan Johnston, who's here beside me, who's leading the team. She's the director of the field school that's involved in the excavations. She's professor of archaeology at George Washington University and specialises in the archaeology of Ireland. She was a PhD student with Bernard Wales. You possibly have a photograph of Bernard, I'm sure, coming up, who led the excavations back 68 to 75. And again, some people here will remember him and his visits to Kilcullen. And she co-authored the Dún Ailinne monograph. It's a book which was published, the findings of those excavations, and it was published in 2007 and was actually launched. The Irish launch took place here, right here in the Heritage Centre here. She led the magnetometer survey of the site from 2006 to 2008, and I'm sure she'll explain a little bit about that. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Professor Susan Johnston to tell you about the current work and the previous work up on the site.
Okay, thanks very much, Noel. Can you all hear me in the back?
Just about.
I've been coming to Ireland since the 1980s. This is the first time I got sick when I got here, so your weather. I have a little bit of laryngitis, so if you can't hear me, just yell and I'll croak louder. So most of you sort of obviously, this is Dún Ailinne, the site that you are familiar with. If you can see it from various places. If you're driving through the Curragh, you can see it from various parts of the road to Athy, so there's various ways to look at it. It is, as Noel said, certainly a very important site, and I am fairly sure the reason that the monastery was originally put where it was precisely because this site was here, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So it is one of what people are increasingly calling ceremonial centers. There are 4 of them that are very, very large. Relatively speaking, you've probably heard of some of them. Dún Ailinne, of course, in County Kildare, Navan Fort, which was known as Owen Macha in various literary sources up in Armagh, Rathcrowan, which was known as Cruchen in ancient literature in Roscommon, and Tara in County Meath. There are also probably smaller ones as well that share some of these characteristics that allow us to define it. They are sometimes called royal sites. Archaeologists have been moving away from that terminology lately, mostly because the idea of kings is probably not quite right for the Iron Age. That's probably a better term for later, although clearly important people were up here, but whether or not we would think of them as kings if we met them is a little bit debatable. So there's been a sort of movement away from calling these royal sites, but certainly these sites were all associated with the sort of four of the big regions in Ireland. Dún Ailinne, of course, with Leinster, and they were probably sort of central places in these regions where people gathered for various reasons. So far, we don't have evidence for anybody living up there in the Iron Age, and so therefore, kind of by default, and also because of some of the other characteristics, we argue that these things have to do with ritual and ceremony, that they were places that people went. They probably carried out various kinds of rituals there. They probably also did other things. We have evidence for things like weaving, for example, weaving tools. We have evidence of things like slag from the metalworking. So it's likely that people did a lot of different things up here, but most of it seems to have been about sort of gathering people together, providing kind of a central focus for the region that would sort of bring people together, give them a place to kind of celebrate a shared identity and that sort of thing. Now, the reason that we think these are all sort of the same thing, or at least part of the same group, they're variations on a theme, is they have a series of shared traits. They tend to be located in landscapes that have a lot of other kinds of ritual sites. Those of you who've been, I'm sure, to Tara know that there's a lot of stuff in and around Tara. There are lots of different kinds of sites out on the Curragh, for example, that would be sort of, some of them at least would be contemporary with Dún Ailinne. And those sites may be burial sites or things like that. We'll actually talk a little bit more about those in a little bit. So generally speaking, these sites are in these kind of landscapes which people probably lived in as well, but also had other kinds of ritual sites in them. One of the big things that they share is they have an external bank and an internal ditch. So here's the logic. If you are going to make a defensive site, you want to have a big bank, okay, that makes it difficult to get in, and you can make it even bigger by building a ditch around the outside. Okay, so in other words, to get in, you not only have to go over the bank, you have to go down the ditch, which makes the bank that much bigger. So a long time ago, some folks made the argument that if you reverse that, it is not a functionally defensive structure. So if you put the ditch on the inside, you've pretty much defeated the purpose. Now, I'm not entirely sure that's necessarily true. A lot depends on how you envision the defenders. I think if you're standing up there sort of popping out arrows, I suspect it doesn't much matter whether there's a ditch or not. But it certainly is a different kind of organization than you see at the living sites. So at these sites, you have the ditch on the inside and then the big bank on the outside. Okay, and those of you, I don't know if anybody was up at Dún Ailinne last year for the open day, or if you've been up there before, but you saw that sort of the huge bank and then the huge sort of ditch, which is in itself a fairly imposing kind of structure. They also have evidence for these timber structures on the inside. There has been excavation at all 4 of the big sites, and they share sort of various configurations of these sort of timber circles, sometimes eerily similar. There's a one at Navan that is organized in this figure of 8. It is smaller, but nevertheless it is a very similar kind of shape to the one up at Dún Ailinne, up on Kilcullen, that also has this kind of figure of 8. So they share sort of this kind of organization internally. These were not, however, buildings as far as we know, in the sense that they were not roofed. So I tend to argue that these were sort of designed to kind of define space. Sort of within this, the important things happened, but they were not places where people were living because it's Ireland and you need a roof. And so in that sense, they were sort of places where people could sort of gather. Maybe some people were allowed in here were allowed in here that were not allowed in here, or something like that. Okay. Okay. Now, as Noel said earlier, excavations were begun here in 1968. They did some work in 1967 as well, some kind of preliminary survey by Bernard Wales, who you see in his dashing vest there up in the corner. And they excavated here between 1968 and 1975. I have lots of these pictures that are not labeled. If anybody recognizes any of these people, I would love to know who they are, because I really don't. A lot of them, some of them do have names on them, usually only first names. But I keep thinking I should put them online and people can see them and then let me know who they are, because I would like to recognize them. I don't know who this is, but the slide says Little John. So you may take that as you will. However, I am fairly sure after some close-up examination last night that standing on the very top of this tower is our own Pam Crabtree. Is that you, Pam?
I think that is.
Yeah. She looks so happy. That was 1972. I don't know. It was labeled 1972, so we blew it up last night, and we were looking at it, trying to figure out who we could recognize, and I was pretty sure that's you. That's the best resolution I can get, unfortunately. So. Okay, so what did they find? Well, they excavated mostly right on the summit of the hill. Dún Ailinne is kind of the bank and ditch. This is the bank and ditch here. It's kind of oddly positioned in that it's sort of draped kind of sideways on the hill rather than being plunked directly on top. Bernard always had a theory, which I think is a reasonable one, that was because when you walk up the hill, that means that the summit of the hill is more imposing visually. Interestingly, Dún Ailinne is the only one of the big four that does not have a constructed mound on top, and his theory was perhaps the actual natural hill provided that mound. So maybe that's why they kind of draped it over the hill that way. But in any case, they excavated this area here. I calculated roughly about 10% of the site. But of course, it being the top, a lot of things were happening up there. And so this is just one of the aerial shots where you can see some of the people and some of the huge structures. I like this picture because it's easy to look at these things and sort of think, okay, yeah, I know what that means. It's 30 meters across or whatever. But it's difficult to imagine until you sort of look at the people and imagine the scale of these things. They were absolutely huge and required an enormous amount of effort. Now, as Noel was saying, certainly Dún Ailinne was an important place in the Iron Age, but there's also evidence people were here even before that. So the hill seems to have been a significant place, certainly as far back as, say, around 3000 or so about 5,000 years ago. There is evidence, for example, of stone tools that date to that period. We still find these in the sort of sod layers today. This is a particular kind of pottery which may have been associated with a burial. There was no evidence of human remains with it. But it is a particular type of vessel that we know dates to that period. And there is a little bit of a Bronze Age presence as well. This is a piece of something which was known, I should change that, it's not known as a food vessel anymore, but anyway, that's what it was known as a while back. But it is, again, a known Bronze Age type. And this particular circle here may also belong to that period, mostly because if you think about the layers, it is underneath everything else. And it has no artifacts in it except for those from the Neolithic and Bronze Age. So it may date to that period as well, although there's no absolute date yet associated with that. But of course, it came into its heyday in the Iron Age. Despite what my students in the last few years believe, they believe there are no artifacts on this site. Maybe Bernard took them all, I don't know. That was it, they were all in the summit, now they're gone. But they did find a lot of stuff that was identifiable in terms of the Iron Age, things like glass beads, bronze pins. These have a certain link to the Roman world, so perhaps maybe some connections with what was going on in Britain at the time. This was probably the top of a bone pin, one tiny, tiny little piece of gold. And glass bracelets and things of that nature. So a lot of these things seem to be things that people would have been wearing, which may have something to do with the idea that people are going up on the hill, they're organizing rituals and things, and they're wearing sort of some of their nicer things as part of that. And then, of course, there were the timber structures. When you stack them all on top of each other, they look like what one person described as the top of a table after a really good party. No? Rings? Nothing? Okay. But if you pull them apart, what you get is initially 3 different phases, which at the time they described by color terms. This is known as the white phase. It was a very simple, relatively simple structure. It was a single ring with some post holes inside. They took that one down and they said, right, we can do better. They did this, which is known as the rose phase, which is that figure of 8 thing I showed you before. It has an entrance to it. Then they took that one down and they built this, which is known as the mauve phase. And it is, again, a circular ditch, which seems to have held, again, upright posts, so it's a palisade. It had a timber circle. Each of these black dots represents one big post, and then this kind of odd structure in the middle, which would theoretically, you could have gone into it, but it wouldn't have, the distance between the posts was probably not much more than that. So maybe this was the most important spot. Maybe only a very small number of people went in there. Maybe people only went in there for some particular purpose or something like that. Okay. We also discovered when we did, and I'll talk more about the magnetometer in a minute, but since I had the rose phase up here, I wanted to put this on. We also found out that the rose phase is part of a larger structure that includes a very, very large, at the very least, a ditch and possibly a palisade around the outside of it, which would have essentially ringed the entire summit of the hill. And that, if you sort of superimpose this on that, basically I tried pink and red, that probably wasn't my best choice, but you can see this was where Bernard ended his excavation, but if you sort of superimpose it on the magnetometer image, and it'll make more sense in a minute, I promise. But it sort of fits, so it was part of this much, much larger space. And part of the reason I put that up there was because in 2016, we managed to get some dates off of some fragments. They were chunks of preserved post. They were not in their original position. They probably had been dumped back in the ditch when the ditch was filled in after they were when they were taking down the rose phase, but before they were putting up the mauve phase. Those came from, can't quite reach, but if you go out sort of that entrance there's an entrance gap there, and those came from either side of that gap. And so those dates date the rose phase between about 200 BCE and 30 BCE. And so that gives you sort of the last couple of hundred years BC, and so sort of between, say, 2000 and 2200 years ago. The mauve phase would then have been after that. The white phase would have been before that. We do not have firm dates for those yet. Stay tuned. We're writing a grant. And then finally, towards the end of the Iron Age, they said, right, we're done with all this stuff. And so they dismantled at least part of the mauve phase and covered it with a series of deposits of animal bone, many of which were burned, which has been interpreted by Pam Crabtree as being the result of ceremonial feasting. So it was this something that they were sort of coming up to do. I have a sort of current working idea that I like, that what do you do when you want to take down a really big timber structure? You invite all your friends and you give them dinner, right? In the U.S. it would be, if you want somebody to help you move, you buy pizza. I don't know what the Irish equivalent would be. But, and so maybe these sort of large ceremonial feasts were about dismantling these structures before putting up something new. Because there is maybe some evidence also for some of that, but on a lesser scale, between the rose phase and the mauve phase. But either way, this structure seems to have been at least partially dismantled because they covered it with the rubbish. Okay? All right. And then after that, of course, the site seems to have, I wouldn't say it was completely abandoned. There are some bits and pieces of evidence up there. They are extremely fragmentary, just like tiny little, like somebody may have been walking through there in the early medieval period and dropped something kind of level. But there is no, at least as far as we know, and keep in mind a huge amount of the site has never been excavated. But as far as we know, there was no sort of real presence in the early medieval period. And so it seems as though the site was on the wane. Now, whether that was helped along or simply marked by the presence of the monastery at Old Kilcullen is a question that's worth asking. But as you can see, they're very close to each other. This is Dún Ailinne while standing at Old Kilcullen, so you can see it's right there. And you can sort of imagine in the 5th century, people are coming in, they want to convert the Irish. One way to do that is to sort of challenge the old ways. One way to do that is to put your site right there and say, look, we have our site, your site's on the wane, our site's on the rise, and therefore you should sort of come to our site and not worry about that one. And so as far as we know, after the very sort of perhaps beginning of the early medieval period, there wasn't much activity up on Dún Ailinne at all, except maybe a little bit of sort of low-level plowing and things like that. We'll get to that later. And then after that, Dún Ailinne pretty much goes into kind of legend and myth and pseudo-history. It is mentioned occasionally in a variety of different sources, and some of this idea that Dún Ailinne has been eclipsed by the arrival of Christianity is indicated by quotes like this, which is from a poem that Allen's proud burghers perished with its warlike host, great is victorious Bridget. So the idea being, haha, Bridget won, you lost. Christianity is going to be kind of the religion of the future. And then there's some really good, actually, I can't get into all that, but some really good later stories. There's one about a bunch of vixens who come out of Dún Ailinne in the middle of the night and charm a man. As the leader for 2 years running of all female crew, I can get into that. I like the vixen idea. Okay, so as Noel mentioned then, so Bernard excavated, as I said, about 10% of the site, which was amazing for the time. I mean, you know, those kind of, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a large-scale excavation. But obviously that leaves a lot of space unknown. So we came back in 2006 and carried out a survey with something called a magnetometer, which essentially measures the difference in the magnetic field between the natural soil and cultural soil. So basically, if you think about it this way, the Earth has a magnetic signature, and so it gives off a magnetic signal. But if you dig a ditch and you then put stuff in it, it changes that signature. And so essentially what this measures is that change, okay? So what you do is you walk around in rain or shine, and behind a little machine that goes beep, beep, every 50 centimeters, which is lots of fun for 6 hours a day. And then you learn a lot about other people's lives. And then you put it all into a computer. The computer converts the readings into a grayscale. So the higher the readings, the darker the image. And that's the really, really exciting part. And so you see all of these things emerge that are not indicated on the surface. So we know they were below ground, but you can't tell that they're there on the surface. Now, it's a little bit like a Rorschach test. So helpfully, I've outlined some of the things that I think are probably worth investigating. I may have to live to 200 to do it all. But there's a lot in there. This is the thing I had mentioned before that's associated with the rose phase, this enclosure that's on the summit. And actually, you can sort of see if you superimpose the timber structures on this image. This is kind of a blow up of that. You can see that this pink thing sort of lines up perfectly with this feature here, which also then ends at this palisade, and there's an entrance here. So that was how we knew that the rose phase was sort of bigger and probably more elaborate. Okay, now, we then also use that to sort of identify things that we would like to investigate in future. And so for the last 2 years, we have been looking at something which was just arbitrarily numbered 13 because it was the 13th thing they noticed. So it was initially called Feature 13. It's located right there. If you blow it up, it looks like that. You sort of lose some resolution, but that's what we have to live with here. I'm not sure, I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but I thought it was probably what's known as a ring ditch. Okay? Now, ring ditch is a very complicated category, but essentially it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a small, sort of relatively small feature. Most of them are between about 15 and 20 meters diameter. And they have a ditch around the outside. Some of them have mounds on the inside. Some of them have banks on the outside. There's a lot of debate about whether they all had all that stuff and it's simply gone because of plowing and all that's left is the ditch. And so there's a whole big thing about that. But the bottom line is, it is one of the most common kinds of monuments in Ireland. There are hundreds of them known. There may well be thousands. I'm not sure. Nobody's counted yet, as far as I know. But they're extremely common. What they are is an interesting discussion. Many of them have nothing in them. However, a proportion of them have human remains in them. The vast majority of them cremations. Most of them don't have artifacts really to speak of, but they do have cremation deposits sometimes in the ditch and also at various places in the middle. And so they may be burial sites at least sometimes. So they're interesting for that reason. They're also interesting because ring ditches are, on the one hand, associated broadly with the other ceremonial centers. And so there are ring ditches associated with Tara and places like that. There are also lots and lots. This is one from the Curragh. There are many of them out on the Curragh. Potter Clancy did a study of them a number of years ago that sort of started to count those up. We don't know exactly when all of them date to. They can date anywhere from the late Bronze Age to the early medieval period, but they are they're sort of everywhere. So we were thinking perhaps they were ring ditches. Okay. Based on the image, the one in there's sort of two superimposed on each other. One of them I call the northern one, and the other one I call the southern one. The northern one appeared sort of initially perhaps to be double. I can't quite point that high, but if you look all the way at the top, you could just about see two rings there, which would be kind of unusual, but given Dún Ailinne's importance, would not necessarily be surprising to have a particularly large and elaborate ring ditch. And so we excavated them, or at least we started excavating them last year. This is sort of the area that we excavated. We were trying to kind of follow the ring around, and we also wanted to pick up the top of this southern one. If you can see the shadow of my finger there. Those of you who came up to the open day last year, you saw this kind of weird shape up there. And we had drones. It was cool. We had 4 guys up there with drones, and my gratitude to them. They were very, very kind. And they came up and they took lots and lots of drone photos. Here's the drone. And basically, that's the excavation from last year. So you can see on the one hand, this one is what I call the southern one. It sort of goes around here, okay? And then the northern one seems to be kind of intermittent. It probably has been plowed out over the years in various places. It was never terribly deep. It's only about sort of yay deep. And so it wouldn't take much to sort of disturb it. So I think that's why it's not continuous. But you can see certainly both of the rings kind of up through there. The southern one, when we were excavating the southern one, we found in it a chunk of what turns out to be a hazel branch that still had some of the bark on it, which was very cool. And so we had that analyzed, which is how I found out it was hazel, and we sent it off to Queen's University and had it dated, and it came back to this date, so between about 170 and 15 BCE, which is almost exactly the same date that we got back for the rose phase, for this structure associated with the rose phase. And so what that means is either both of them were there at the same time. So within this big enclosure, you had this big timber structure and perhaps these little, at least one of these little ring structures, or they were at least built sort of approximately in the same time period. So when you built, those who built one would have known the other existed, depending on which one was built first. Never mind. Okay, so fast forward to this year. So this year, what I was interested in particular was, on the one hand, trying to follow this further down. So I kind of wanted to see what was going on over here. There's some dark imagery in the magnetometer that suggests something interesting going on there. And so I wanted to see what was going on there. And I wanted to sort of push it this direction, because if there were deposits of human remains, they would be they might be towards the center. And in 2018, while we didn't find human remains for sure, we did find a lot of very tiny fragments of burned bone. We cannot say for sure who they belong to, what species. They could also be non-human animal. So we can't say for sure, but it's possible, it was sort of possible that there might be something sort of in that area. So we opened up a very large area, which was enormously energetic. They did a great job. And then we lined them all up and said, right, trowel, I'm going to the pub. No, I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that. And we found so many features. I have to admit, I thought it was going to be mostly empty. I was actually a little worried. I was like, what are we going to do with these kids? I brought them all here. We have to have something for them to do. But, oh, no, that didn't happen. It looks like a lunar landscape up there. So unfortunately, the drone guys, God love them, are coming back Wednesday, so I'll have better photos then. So we can't really get above it, so you kind of have to look at it this way. But there are tons and tons and tons of post holes and sort of big, from fairly big post holes to very small, probably stake holes. Some of them are pits. It's going to take me a while to sort of untangle a lot of it. So we are just sort of in the process, but we cleared, we've cleared at least 68 features as of last Tuesday. So you'd have to add in probably 5 or 6 more after that at least. So let's go with 70. It's a nice round number, okay? Which is a lot of features, okay? So we had the remains of all of that, which would be in what is this, so the north is this way. So this would be sort of the middle, okay, of those ring ditches. And we also found what we think are traces of the southern ring ditch again. So there's the drone photo again. This is a drawing, if you like drawings better. I'm very proud of this, so because they did such a great job. This was actually 3 different drawings made by 3 different groups of people that I stitched together, and it was almost perfect, so they did good. And so what we were looking at was down here, and you can see in this shot very clearly, we think that this is the continuation of that ditch. So I was trying to fiddle with it. You can't really line it up because this is taken at an angle and this is taken directly over. But basically, this ends here and it picks up here, more or less. You can't quite see where I am. And then goes around. Oh yeah, you can see it like that. We have now actually excavated this end of it as well, or large parts of this end. And it does appear to be the ditch in there, although there are parts where it seems to disappear as well, probably because of plowing. So we have a better handle on that, and some idea then that this ditch does in fact continue around, and does not. I thought these two might actually intersect, but they don't. We also had hoped perhaps to push farther and pick up what would be the extension of these two, but we had so much stuff at the other end we ran out of time, so next year. We found a few artifacts. Pam, I don't know what you were wearing in 1972, but if you're missing a bead, I think we found it. If you've got the necklace, God help you. We found, yes, folks, 1970, I believe it was dated. Yeah, okay. But we also found some of these stone tools that you find sort of scattered throughout a lot of the site. This is a little scraper. It's got some sort of nibbling on one side. So basically, if you make a stone tool and you want to make it sharp, you just keep chipping off the edge and that makes it sharp. This one has, again, also some chipping on it. This one is just a flake. It's probably a waste product from making stone tools, but that counts because it indicates people were up there making stone tools. So we do have a few artifacts. So far, nothing Iron Age, nothing particularly staggering, although I'm not sure how much a 50p piece is worth now. Probably not much. And some other interesting sort of patterns. I'm still sort of trying to untangle this, but again, it's a bit like a Rorschach test. But if you sort of start to look at the pattern of these things, for example, I am, as everybody on the site knows, obsessed with this arc right here. There seems to be an arc of post holes, 1, 2, if you follow the shadow, 3, 4, 5, 6, that seem to be in an arc. And I wonder if that is perhaps part of some kind of a structure or some kind of a wooden arrangement of posts. This one is a line. So where I believe is that Julia? Yeah. You have to learn everybody's hats because you can't see their faces. What hat do we have? So where Julie is excavating is actually part of that southern ring ditch, and there seems to be a line of 3 and possibly 4 posts that seems to lead right to it. So is that part of it? We're not sure. We also today, I don't have a good picture of it, today we also uncovered some little divots in the side of that southern ring ditch, which seem to suggest that there were posts either actually in the side of the ditch or right up next to it. So maybe the ditch was at least in some places lined with posts or something like that. This is one of these little stake holes, and this may, and I emphasize may, be the remains. If you see there's like a little dark streak down the middle, that may actually be staining from the original stake that was in it. We were unable to kind of take it out whole, so it was mostly just fragments. But it is possible that it was maybe a stake in it that was still sort of surviving. And then it's also very clear that plowing happened up here. You can see a series of stripes, okay? That's not a fashion statement. That appears to be plow furrows. And so a lot of the stuff that was up here also was maybe kind of messed up or chewed around because of plowing, which may have happened any time from the medieval period right the way up to the 19th century. It hasn't been plowed that anybody knows of in relatively recent times. But certainly there is evidence of plowing up there, so somebody was up there plowing at some time. And so the plow sort of interfered with some of them, but the plow features themselves are also archaeological information, and that's interesting too. I put this, this is all the stuff that we have shot in with we have a transit, that yellow, if you've ever seen that yellow thing that they use, sometimes road crews use them. That allows us to fix points, and this is what we've got so far. So I'm going to have a good 6-8 months trying to untangle what we have, but there is a lot going on up there sort of in the middle of this ring ditch, and Suzanne will clean this up and make it look pretty later, but that's all she could give me right now. Just to give you a sense of just how much is up there. So we've got people up there putting up structures, putting up posts, maybe posts that are carved, maybe posts that are sort of marking space. Maybe they're just posts that are ordinary things for ordinary reasons. We don't know. But people are up there sort of busily modifying the landscape, kind of marking this place as theirs for thousands of years. And so there's certainly enough up there to keep us busy, certainly keep me busy for a lifetime. So. Okay, and as always, I just want to do my thanks to everybody. The Thompson family, Vicki didn't make it. She was going to come. But without them, I couldn't do this. It's their private property, and they have always been very, very kind to let me up there. We are a sponsored project of the Blackfriary Archaeology Field School up in Trim in County Meath, which is run by Finola O'Carroll. And so they provide us with sort of all the infrastructure tools and stuff like that. Obviously, you folks who I adore, the community, the Heritage Centre, Nessa, who we love, all of the host families who very kindly put up with my students, the guys who come up with the drones, we love them, and then also, of course, my amazing crew. That was at the end of week 2. I was beginning to think perhaps I wasn't working them hard enough if they had that much energy at the end of week 2. But the picture for week 3, they're actually, some of them are lying down, so I think that's a good sign. So, okay, so that's all I have. If anybody has questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.